Hello everybody, this is Durwin Banks and I'm here in London to talk to my friend Ed Siebert. Hello Ed.
Hi, how are you?
We're shaking hands.
Durwin, nice to see you again after a while.
So we're sitting in Ed's lovely flat overlooking the Thames and it's the most beautiful day. And Ed, we're surrounded by lots of drawings, or the watercolours they are you did. I think they're of Europe, aren't they, shortly after the war? When did you came to Europe?
Well, I first came to Europe after World War II, when I was in design college in New York. I got a scholarship to travel to Europe because the school had a summer trip,
Right.
which was highly organized with seeing all the museums. Well, we had 2 months in Paris, which for a first visit to Europe was fabulous.
Was it did it have some war debris around, or was it not too bad?
No, the only thing one saw in Paris was bullet marks on
right.
certain buildings in the great squares and so forth. A bit later on that trip, I did go over from France to Germany to visit my mother's relatives, because I was on the way to Italy and I did it via Germany and Switzerland. And there were, as I traveled east from Paris to go to German border and over, there were still entire villages that were
Just destroyed.
In the war, that had not been repaired or rebuilt, and most of the railway stations in Germany were still had no glass in them and all that sort of thing. But Paris was fabulous because it was all working again.
It was all working. Are most of these pictures from around
Paris?
Paris?
These pictures around the walls, no, the only one of Paris is directly behind you, the black and white there, which is of a small place in Paris, my favorite work. And the others are all things that were done after the European trip, and they're mostly line and they're watercolor with line. And it's probably interesting to note that the line work was done with turkey quills.
Was it?
Yes, we used turkey quills because when you sharpened them, they were absolutely wonderful to draw with.
Yeah, and they're all so evocative. I've always loved them. I think they're just so fantastic, and you obviously love them because you've got them up all around.
Yeah, well, it's all I have left of when I did that trip to Europe, I was a scholarship student.
Right.
And the way the school paid for the scholarships was at the end of the trip, and the whole trip was about 5 months, France and Italy. And at the end of the trip, if you were a scholarship student, the school claimed first
some of your work.
Yeah, they wanted all of your work because they always held an exhibition of work done advertising the school's European connections.
Yeah.
And so I had done so much work that they had the exhibition and I had lots of stuff in it, and it kept selling. And the chief instructor, Betty, kept calling me every few days because I was in a job then back after the trip, and saying, "Do you have any more sketches? Do you have any more sketches?" Because the money went for the scholarships.
Right.
That was my way of putting something back in.
Yeah.
But that trip was a marvelous experience for me.
Yeah, tremendous.
And
of course, on the wall behind you, you've got lots of jugs. And you've got all these silver candlesticks. Tell me about them. I remember you telling me about before. There's something special about them, isn't there?
Well, they're mercury glass.
Mercury glass.
And it's highly collectible. And mercury glass, which is glass with mercury inside, and the good examples have a little cork in the bottom,
right,
to keep the air from getting rid of all the silver that's inside, or the mercury, I should say. And they all were the poor man's version of having silverware.
Okay.
And I had a friend in New York who had a fabulous collection of this sort of thing, all of which was lost in a fire. But I always had been attracted to it, and then, every once in a while my antiquing, I'd see one. And then over the years I've just, I add a piece when I go to an antique show, and they make a good display, don't they?
They do. I mean, your displays are brilliant.
And all my other pottery is all French.
Oh, French. Right.
Almost all of it is French.
And you picked them up one at a time?
One at a time, yeah.
Because they kind of graduated. You'd think you'd bought them as a set.
Well, no, I'm afraid that's my habit of lining things up.
I like it. Yeah.
And
that must be the old army training.
Yeah, in my kitchen you'll find a windowsill full of pitchers. What do you call them? Jugs.
Yeah.
Jugs. No, these are all, and there's, when I go to antique shows, there is a woman I always see who sells this kind of French stuff that I like. And she knows I'm getting on a bit. And she wants to stay in contact because she wants to get hold of all this because, it all gets sold eventually. There's no more coming.
I'm sure that's right.
But I love them. Anything speckled and smeary. And there's a whole story behind those blue ones.
The plates.
The plates, yeah. They're something very, very special. And I've got 5 pieces. And there's something...
Are they French?
No, they're English. And they're... oh God, I can't think of it. A very famous English pottery ware. What do we call it?
Not to worry. It's great to have just a little insight into your collecting habits there. But I actually.
Now, what about the hands?
The hands.
I have a passion for hands, and they all started. It started with the tiny one at the end, which is a marionette hand,
right?
Which I found on the highway in Connecticut, Sunday antiquing, centuries ago, and all the others are glove lasts.
Right.
Except for 1 or 2. And had a lovely lady here about a year and a half ago who came to collect something I was giving to a mutual friend in France. And when she'd never been here. And she saw all of those hands of glove lasts and so forth. She kept being intrigued, and it turned out that somebody in her family in New York had a shop where they made, did the leather work, that was done based on those things.
Yeah.
Anyhow, just another story.
So you were talking...
little cat from the cottage.
The cat from the cottage. But you were talking about centuries ago. Actually,
yeah.
You're well into your 90s, Ed, aren't you?
I will be 95 next month.
95, so that means you were born in what year?
1923.
1923. So
and I have the magic, easy to remember numbers that they always ask for birth and all at the NHS. 231123.
Right.
So very, very easy to remember.
That's great. So when you think back to those times, well, you can't go quite back to those times, but who was the president? Do you remember who was a president then?
Herbert Hoover.
It was Hoover then.
It was the end of Hoover, and it became Roosevelt.
And
I remember that as something like a 5 or 6 year old.
Yeah. So that was during Prohibition as well, wasn't it? Or was it just before?
I can remember my father coming home a little tipsy.
Right.
When Franklin Roosevelt, the first day that, what's it called? The Prohibition ended. My father and his co-workers in the office he worked, he was a bookkeeper.
Right.
He came home a little tiddly, and my mother was not pleased. But I can remember that. He was a bit tiddly, and they'd gone out for beers from the office because there was something. And that all happened in 1932, I think.
Right.
When that came
So it was
off.
kind of women that led that march to begin with, wasn't it? Because their men were
I
already
think
drunk.
so.
And,
Oh yeah, the men
and then
were-
I think in the end, maybe women had something to do with getting rid of it as well. I'm not too sure about that, but actually, thinking even a little bit farther back, there were probably people alive from the Civil War when you were born.
Well, my only connection with that was I knew a lovely old lady, Granny Reeve, who was a friend of mine. I mean, her family was a friend of mine. Was friends with them, and they were an old Philadelphia family. But I got to know Granny Reeve, and it turned out that she was a young girl living in Washington, D.C. during when the Civil War was just over,
Right.
the end of the Civil War, and when the what's the word for
When it was kind of an armistice, wasn't it? Or they
yeah,
they decided to stop.
whatever it was called.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I was always intrigued that I was chatting to a lady who, as a little girl, was around when the Civil War ended.
Yeah, that's sort of all this
In
connection.
Washington.
Have you watched any of those films by Ken Burns about the Civil War? Absolutely brilliant films he's made of it. And
You mean the whole series?
Yes. Yeah.
I think I've seen it in the States. I don't recognize the name Ken Burns. But
Yeah, he's done all sorts of wonderful things, but I've watched those things and I see the names of the battles, and aren't they?
Oh, yeah.
You know, Appomattox,
Appomattox,
and the Battle of
Of
Bull
course,
Run.
Gettysburg was
Gettysburg.
always imprinted on my memory because it wasn't far away from Baltimore.
No.
And we used to drive up that way of a Sunday. You know, I can remember so clearly when my father had our first car. That was about 1935. And it was just a small Hudson car. And the family of five, we all poured into it. And we'd have that little Sunday drive after church to the countryside. And we'd stop, and it was still Depression, and we'd stop at a farmhouse where they would offer Sunday dinners. And it was like $1 a person. And you'd go into their home, sit in their dining room, and the whole family were involved. All the girls were bringing the food in. And you just have endless, wonderful farm food, you know, fresh chicken, fresh vegetables, all that stuff. And that was such a treat for us.
Yeah.
Absolute treat.
Because that was devastation for lots all the way, for farmers all the way through the Midwest and so on. I don't suppose you got that far.
No. When
you know,
I
the-
say
the
going to
Dust
the country,
Bowl.
we'd be going up just north of Baltimore,
North, yeah.
which would basically be in the direction of New Jersey and New York.
Yeah.
But it was that Sunday drive, and then we'd end up somewhere where they made special ice cream. We'd have an ice cream. And those were wonderful treats in our time, you know, that didn't cost much and were just very special.
We seem to have lost the appreciation of that simple stuff a bit, don't we?
I think so.
Yeah.
No, I can remember when we first had an electric refrigerator. And before that, I can remember every Sunday the pattern was after church and dinner at home, except when we went to the countryside, we'd go to my grandmother's. And the whole big family, because my mother was one of 10, so there were lots of aunts and uncles and cousins and nephews and nieces and all that. And we'd be coming home after dark from Grandma's, and the first thing when we got home was always to get to the ice box, which it had a thing to catch the water from the ice as it melted underneath, and it would always overflow. Somebody had always forgotten it. It was always a race to catch up with the... So when we got the electric refrigerator, it was called a Frigidaire.
A Frigidaire, yeah.
Famous brand. And that was one little worry one didn't have.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I can remember that when we had the old ice box, we called it. And of course, one had the ice delivery once a week.
Yeah.
That came up the back alley, horse and cart. And in the winter, when there was ice, the poor horses would
slip all over the road.
And fall, and they'd have a terrible time getting them up again and all that.
So, of course, your grandmother at that time, she would have been right in amongst the Civil War then. Was there any members of your family, you think, involved in the fighting?
No, because they all came from Germany.
Oh, later, afterwards?
And they came just before World War One.
Okay, right.
My mother came to America as a young girl. She was probably about 15 or 16. And this was a couple of years before the First World War broke. And my mother and father conducted their premarital
shenanigans.
What do you call it?
Romance?
Romance, yeah. Their romance in Baltimore, Maryland. When the war came, they were young people who had both different families come to America. And they, if you were what was called an enemy alien, that is recently from, say, Germany, and often if you still hadn't got your passport and all of that, you were confined to certain parts of the city.
Yeah.
And my mother would have to cheat on that to meet up with my father when they were courting. That's the word I was trying to think of before. When they were courting. And and my mother was old enough there were 10 children in that family that came over, and so those who could had to work because money was needed. And so my mother was just old enough not to go back into school, but to have to become a nanny.
Right.
Because Baltimore was full of German families.
Right.
And they all, these girls all spoke German, of course. So, yeah, it was a big fun family.
Yeah, so America was populated that way, and of course the First World...
strangely enough, New York wasn't the only entry port for, of course, Boston was very big for the Irish, but Baltimore had always been a big city for Germans to come to.
Right.
And then, of course, lots of Germans went to Milwaukee and places like that out west a bit. But, yeah, that all goes back quite far.
Yeah. And then, of course, the...
And, we made do. I was talking earlier with you about kids nowadays having so much to keep them interested and to try to stretch their minds and teach them things. And we didn't have all that.
No.
Even if there was money for it, there just wasn't there wasn't a lot of that sort of thing. And we did our learning, of course we went to school, but we did our learning by making our own clay. You just needed paper and a couple of crayons and maybe an old pillow or a piece of fabric, cloth or something.
Well, there was only rudimentary radio, wasn't there? When did you first hear a radio?
Well, my father, our first radio was a crystal set.
Yeah.
A big one, not a little fiddly kid's one. This was a big one with big knobs on it, and my father made it.
Right.
My father was very, very bright. My father was extremely good at all the kind of things I'm not good at, technical stuff.
We're all different.
Mainly because he was, I'm sure, always very interested, and I never was in technical stuff, electrical stuff. My brother was a whiz at all this, but my father was wonderful. And I remember he used to loved repairing watches, and they were mostly the big pocket watches at that point. Not,
Yeah.
but he used to bring home all his workmates' watches and clean them and repair them for them and all that sort of thing. You know, he was brilliant at that. He was a good carpenter, very good at all electrics, as was my brother. I was hopeless.
People had to be much more resourceful, I
Oh
think.
yeah. And I remember my father used to talk about this. Happened, I think, after I grew up. It probably was still happening after I was born, but soon stopped. But my father used to make root beer in the basement.
Oh.
And
Did it ever explode?
and he, I think so, but I can remember.
We call it ginger beer.
He
of
still
course,
had the thing that the gadget that popped the corks in.
Right.
And all that sort of thing. And I remember during the Prohibition, before that finished, I can remember when we used to go to my grandfather's, my father's father. They supposedly were making a little drink in the tub or in a bowl, you know. And I remember being given they were making something they called near beer.
Right.
And I was once given a tiny little taste, probably on my insistence, when I was just a tyke, and it was awful. Terrible bitter stuff. But yeah, they used to make a bit of booze of their own. Gosh.
So that was. So now we're getting towards maybe the 20s or the 30s. The 30s was the end of the Prohibition, and of course, was that still going on during the Depression? Because that lasted for a few years, really, almost up until the Second War, doesn't it? No, the Depression.
Oh, the Depression. Yeah, I think the Depression began to.
29,
mind you,
wasn't it?
during the whole Depression, my father, unlike stories I knew about neighbors having a time with money and just, feeding the family and all of that, my father always, he was a public accountant or something they called it, and he made enough for us to not
suffer.
Yeah, we were always properly clothed because my mother was very clever with the money and that sort of thing, unlike some of the neighbors had real problems. But I can remember that things began to loosen up a bit in sort of like 1936, 1937. I remember my father, my mother, and myself and my sister, we took a Greyhound bus trip from Baltimore out to Indiana, where a sister of my mother and her husband, who was a cleric, preacher.
Right.
They had been to India. When they came back from India, as what do you call the religious people?
Hindus or Muslims?
No, what do you call it when you go out?
Yogis?
To change.
Missionary.
Missionaries. They were missionaries. God, my mind's gone. And when they came back to America, there wasn't a church for him, but they ended up. He got a wonderful Uncle Gottlieb. His name was. God is love. They were out in Indiana, and we took this Greyhound bus tour out to Indiana, and that was in something like 37 or 38, and we would not have had the money for that because it was four of us.
Yeah.
We went. My brother didn't go. So things obviously had
Improved a bit.
loosened up enough for us to be able to do that trip.
Yeah, so...
And what a trip it was. It was like when people go to Europe from the States nowadays, it's that big deal. This was that kind of a big deal to make that trip.
Yeah.
And it was an absolute adventure because it went through so many places. And you got to know the countryside. And there weren't the great highways. It was
Yeah.
all in, byways and so forth, and comfort stops in funny little towns like Muncie, Indiana, that you'd never heard of in your life. And quite a trip that was.
Yes, so for us over here, I mean, we hear about Greyhound. There's always a great romance about
Oh yeah,
your cross-country Greyhound
it
trips.
was very exciting, they had the comfort stops, and it was all. It worked like railway lines, They had all their stations, had to get to the next station, then they always had to wait there, and they had passengers to pick up there and passengers to lose, more luggage to put on, and that sort of thing.
That's pretty much come to an end now, I think, hasn't it? I mean, there still are Greyhound buses, I think, but
There still are,
but not.
and there's some people who think they'll see the country better from a bus
Yeah.
than a train, as you would.
Mm.
As you would. But talking about trains, if we move ahead to when I went into the service,
Yeah.
I was drafted into the service in 1943 when the worst of the war was beginning to be over.
Right.
World War II, I'm talking about.
Well, not in the east, but certainly a little bit in the west.
In Europe, yeah. And I remember the first. I was drafted into the service in Baltimore, and we ended up in El Paso, Texas, for training on the Mexican border. And when the war began to change in Europe, when there was that last great surge, what the heck was it called?
D-Day after 19...
No, it was before D-Day.
Before
There was
D-Day.
that last great surge when it was the beginning of turning the Germans back,
Yeah.
and the Germans beginning to be losing. We were, having got in the war late, we were no longer trained for what they needed, and we were sent back from an anti-aircraft artillery training center to an infantry training center, because we lost so many men in that last push in Europe that everybody who wasn't assigned had to go back in the infantry and be flown to Europe. And it was only because of my art school training that I was transferred to a unit which did, what's the name for it? You do training aids, a training aids unit, where we designed and silkscreen printed stuff to help in training.
So you had a useful skill that was needed.
I had a useful skill, yeah. And most of my mates, I got transferred to this unit, and by then we were in California. And all my mates were sent immediately to infantry camps, given a couple of weeks of quick additional training, and flown to the front in Europe. Belgian Bulge, it was called.
Battle of the Bulge, yeah.
Battle of the Bulge.
That was after D-Day, I think. D-Day was when the invasion happened.
Oh, yeah.
June 1944.
Yeah, I'm getting the time mixed.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that. I was wondering, did Ripley have any influence? Did you know about Ripley, who was doing all the drawings and the wonderful world of Ripley? He went all over the world and he did these drawings.
Robert Ripley?
Yeah, he was. He had all these questions.
Yeah,
like he said, who flew the Atlantic? He wasn't the first man to fly the Atlantic.
I know who you mean, and I'm trying to think of the word for it. I mean, he had a regular column in all the newspapers.
He did.
He did films and all that sort of thing. What was that called?
Ripley's World, I think, or something like
that. I don't recall hearing anything about Ripley back in my service days. But the thing that got me onto the whole thing about the service was, at the point where they needed all these people who were not assigned back in the States to go to Europe because of the bulge and the loss of life there, I was in a camp in California, and they put us on trains to send us to the East Coast for further training. And that train went from California into Texas, and it was operated like a troop train, meaning it had to take circuitous routes and all kind of stuff that was supposedly going to confuse the enemy, who was pretty far away in Europe. But they were following, army methods. And I can never forget that we were in Texas alone 5 days.
My God.
Before we got through Texas and on to get to the... I ended up in North Carolina.
That was a wobbly route then.
Oh yeah, they did a real twisty route. And that troop train used to stop. And I had my 21st birthday on that troop train. And my birthday always falls close to Thanksgiving Day. It's either a day or two before or a day or two after, depending on how the months go. And so on the troop train, we were given a Thanksgiving dinner out of tins while we were moving up this damn train. By then we were probably in Mississippi or someplace, or Louisiana, someplace like that. And I had my 21st birthday with a tinned Thanksgiving dinner on a troop train.
What was it? A tinned turkey?
Tinned turkey and stuffing, but all the makings, but it was all in tins.
Yeah.
And the trains used to stop twice a day, and we all had to march off in order and do calisthenics out in wherever they found a field or something where the train could stop. And we'd have to, which was the right thing to do. Where we, 5 days on it. It took us 5 days to cross the continent by train.
Tremendous.
And in the
That'll keep you fit.
In the South, the trains would stop in little towns, and all the little black boys would come running with watermelons, and they'd be dancing for us, outside of the train windows, when the train would stop for us to throw coins and stuff. So
right.
I'll tell you, it was something
else.
And that whole thinking about the whole span of my life, that whole period of time, I was 3 years in the service, and by good fortune, I didn't get sent to a battlefront.
But did you get to Europe in the service? No, not at all.
No, never got out of the States. But that was a real school, being in the Army, because I was exposed to and living with chaps from all over the country. We had a guy who was going to Yale, getting a doctorate at Yale, and there were car thieves from Pittsburgh. It was a real education.
Yeah, it put everybody together, didn't they? All in the same boat, as it were.
A real education, and there were the people that you learn to know, the people who skived out of any kind of duties, and then there were the other people who never complained when they had to do the skived people's duties, and you learn just a great deal. I am right.
No, it's brilliant. It's brilliant.
But no, when I think back, I do have to say that when I think of all the things that are done for children now, they're good things. They're trying to enlarge their minds and get them, teach them all kinds of proper things that one should know. But we don't seem to be very resilient with life, though, do we? Even people have so many life problems. Well, they talk about all these children who have mental problems. I mean, they're talking about like 5-year-olds and so forth.
Yeah.
Jesus, have them go out and do something, make something out of nothing. We didn't have playthings; we made them.
No, that's right. Well, I've got my own ideas about that, but we won't go into that there. So after that, had you finished all your kind of university or college things by the end of the war, or did you go back?
When I came out of when I went into the service, I had been going to art school and university. I was actually training to be an art school teacher in the public school system, and so I had to have university credits. So I was going to the oh God, what's the main university in Baltimore? This is dreadful. Anyhow, I was going to university and art school at the same time. I needed to get the academic credits. And I was it was a 4-year course. I had 3 years of it when I went into the service. When I came out of the service, I had totally changed my mind about what I wanted to do with my life. Didn't want to be an art teacher. I wanted to be a commercial artist. And I went back to the school in Baltimore for a brief term and began to learn about a school in New York which was meant to be the best in the U.S. for what I wanted to do. And I went up to New York, to that school, with my portfolio to see if I could get admission. And I wanted to go directly into the 3rd year, and they wouldn't. They said, no, you need our 1st year training. You need to have
start at the beginning.
Our kind of training. And the thing is that Uncle Sam was paying for this. When you came out of the service, you could go to college, university, anything like that, provided you qualified.
Yeah.
Uncle Sam paid the bill.
That's great.
Which was absolutely brilliant. So I went off to New York, and the school said, we'll let you into, come up for summer school. This was in 1946, summer. Come up for summer school, that's 6 weeks. And we'll then decide whether we will be able to put you in the final 3rd year because of your previous training. And they did eventually, because I did well. And I went into the 3rd year, and I finished all of that. I never did finish all the university stuff. I didn't get the doctorate.
No, it didn't seem to hold you back, though.
No. And when I finished that schooling, one of the people who came as a outside critic at the school, one of these people who came and looked at everybody's work and so forth hired me for my first job. And in that job, he needed somebody to work with the person who was doing package design in this quite exclusive small design studio. And that was my first training in packaging design, which became my
whole life.
What my whole life was after that. And when I did my famous European trip with the school, I was already in a job. And I got fired. And there was some problem with something to do with the man who owned the business, gave me an assistant who had some kind of connection with his family, and the person wasn't helpful to me, and we couldn't agree about it, so he fired me. And the school found out I was free, wasn't in a job, gave me the scholarship, and I had that 5.5 months.
The fickle finger of fate.
Yeah, exactly. And when I came back from the school trip, I went back to the school as an assistant to the woman who had given me the scholarship. And I did that for a while and freelanced for a while, and then I began to find that I needed to be...
Look for a serious job, was it?
I needed to be out working in the field.
Yeah.
Because too much was happening in the packaging world, and I wasn't picking it up as working at the school.
Right.
So that's when I got the job with the Desky organization, and from then on I was working with them.
So Desky, when you were employed there, are we talking about mid-50s now?
I went to Desky in something like about 1952.
52, right.
And I worked there until 1963. I was a design director for a couple of clients. It was all packaging.
Right.
As a specialty, and the major client, who was Procter & Gamble, needed our kind of packaging design work in Europe, because they now had companies in every capital in Europe, based in Brussels, the central thing. And so the organization in New York needed to send some people to set up an office in London. And I was asked to be one of the people. And that brought me to Europe.
So that's mid-60s now then?
That was 63.
63, yeah.
And in
just in time for this really bad winter.
Yeah. Yeah. I got the... No, I came in May, which was after it.
Oh, right, okay.
And I do remember the first winter I was here, which would be 63, because I came in May 63, there was one last great fog in London, and I had some
We used to call
idea
them the pea supers.
Yeah, and I had, and I couldn't believe it. You could stand on a curb and not see traffic that was inches away, and the smell was terrible. And it didn't last very long, that one, but it gave me an idea of what it had all been about. You know, the big horrible time. But so I came over and had not only to see that the design work was produced, but had to set up for it. And there was no setup over here like we had in New York for getting all the kind of things done that we needed to do our work.
Yeah.
And I had to develop all those sources.
So it's a pretty big job.
Well, it was. And not too long, I guess within the first year, no, after about a year and a half, the chap who'd been hired to head up the London office, I was head of design, he was the admin, he left us, unhappy for some reason or other. And old Don Desky flew over and appointed me the head of the Siebert, of the Donald Desky organization in London. And so I was then the real head and design head as well. And I felt the need for marketing expertise that I didn't feel I had. And I got the go-ahead to hire somebody to supply that. And that was Richard Head. And Richard Head and I eventually, thanks more to his careful planning and so forth and strategy, we left the Desky organization and became Siebert Head.
Yeah.
And that was my career till I left.
Was that the end of Desky? Were they?
No, they sent somebody in to supposedly take care of things, and we managed quite legally to hire away about 4 of the people we really wanted from the organization and who wanted to come with us.
Right.
And that left a skeleton staff for the Desky organization. The Desky organization bought into another British organization that was failing, and another year later they'd all failed.
Right.
It all closed down. That was the end of it. But
so you were in a good position by then.
Yeah. And the whole business of breaking away and setting up on our own, you know, it was hard work. A lot of hard work, and thanks to Richard Head's administrative
abilities,
yeah, and his strategic planning and all of that, at one point it became a cops and robbers kind of thing. People making calls to find out who might be in London from New York and where they were staying and whether they actually were here and all that. And we found out that old Desky was offering the company to somebody in Brussels. without our knowledge and so forth. So anyhow, we got out in time, and Siebert had, thanks very much to Richard's management, business management, and financial management, and my input for the product, we were extremely successful. And when I finally came to retirement time, it was all done carefully with us selling the company first.
It's still going, I think, isn't it?
I think so, but
yeah.
there's a branch in Poland, believe it or not.
So we're talking when you started that in, what was that, sort of 67 or 66?
It was, when we started that, it was 59, I think.
69.
59.